As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine one of the world's most powerful economies is cutting off its own future with its own hands, not with war or sanctions, but with decisions that destroy the trust of allies and undermine the foundations of the global order. America, which has spent decades building a system of alliances and trade ties, suddenly begins to behave as if it needs no one. But the world is watching closely. And where some see domestic politics, others see an opportunity to permanently change the balance of power.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
At first, it looked like a routine raid on a working enterprise. Agents managed to detain hundreds of foreign engineers, and this was presented as a defense of national interests. But there was more to it than just dry statistics. These people were not illegal immigrants, but key specialists, the brains and hands behind projects that were supposed to ensure America's technological leadership in the coming decades. Their humiliating detention came as a shock, not only to South Korea, but to the whole of Asia. In the newspapers of the allied country, they were called not simply arrested, but prisoners. And that word turned out to be far more dangerous than any tariff.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
While Washington explained its actions as concern for jobs, on the other side of the continent, an event was taking place that the American media chose to say almost nothing about. Canada began to rewrite the rules of the game. In just 1 year, the country was able to sharply reduce its dependence on the American market and direct its resources to where demand was growing rapidly: Asia. Oil, gas, rare minerals, everything that was previously considered part of the American sphere of influence suddenly became a tool for creating new alliances. And this turnaround did not take decades. It happened before the eyes of a single generation of investors. What does this mean for the US? A loss of trust, a loss of capital, and most importantly, a loss of people who are ready to build the future. In a country that has concentrated the best talent for decades, the opposite processes are now gaining momentum. Engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs are increasingly seeking stability not in California, but in Seoul, Tokyo, and Ottawa. And money follows them, because capital always goes where there is reliability and respect.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
With each passing month, it becomes clearer that this is not a one-off mistake, but a systemic trend. American soft power is crumbling. Allies are beginning to build their own economic blocs and conclude deals in national currencies, bypassing the dollar. What seemed impossible not long ago is happening today. For the first time in decades, the world is beginning to ask itself, is America really necessary to move forward? This is not a fantasy or a prediction for the distant future. It is a chain of real events that have already been set in motion and are gaining momentum. Historians will argue about when exactly the turning point began, but many will point to the day when allies were escorted out of American borders in handcuffs as the moment when the world realized that the old era was over. And now the main question remains: if the allies no longer trust America, if resources are moving east, if talent is choosing other countries, who will be the architect of the new world order? We are beginning to see the answer right now.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
It all started when, one September day, federal agents suddenly appeared at American factories working on the future of energy and microelectronics. To the public, it looked like just another operation to bring order to the field of labor migration. News channels repeated dry phrases: raid, document checks, hundreds of detainees. But the reality turned out to be much more serious. Among those who were led away in handcuffs and put on buses were not temporary workers without visas, but engineers and technicians from South Korea who had gone through all the official procedures and been invited to the country to build a key enterprise, a battery factory that was to become the basis of the new US energy strategy. These people designed energy storage systems capable of changing the balance of power in the automotive and defense industries. Several dozen of them participated in the creation of prototypes that were linked to the future of American military drones and autonomous vehicles. As a result, in a matter of hours, not just a contract was destroyed, but trust that had been built up over decades. When images of engineers in handcuffs appeared in the South Korean media, the reaction was immediate. One of the largest conservative publications in Seoul called it military humiliation without war, and popular TV channels broadcast footage from the airport around the clock, where the deported specialists were returning home. Spontaneous protests began in Korea near the US Embassy. People took to the streets with posters comparing their ally to former colonial powers, and leading political analysts began to say that, for the first time in post-war history, Washington was seen not as a guarantor of security, but as a threat to national pride. The South Korean Prime Minister made a strong statement, emphasizing that the arrested engineers were a symbol of the country's technological future and that their detention was perceived as deliberate humiliation.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
This event became a kind of point of no return. After all, America and Korea are not just partners. Korean companies have been supplying components for American electronics, military equipment, and space programs for decades. Imagine if Apple or Nvidia lost access to the best chip manufacturing specialists and the defense industry lost contractors willing to produce batteries for new fighter jets. That is exactly what happened. But it's not just about lost projects. Much more important is how this scandal was perceived in the region. Chinese analysts called it a gift from fate, because now they have a chance to offer Korea a much more stable partnership. Articles appeared in Japan saying that America is becoming an unstable neighbor, and there were calls to strengthen Asian alliances without Washington. Even in Australia, the idea was raised in parliamentary debates that it is unsafe to trust a country that treats its own allies this way. Within America itself, everything that was happening was presented as a struggle for jobs. Officials claimed that foreign engineers were allegedly taking bread from the mouths of local specialists. But the figures told a different story. The raid coincided with the publication of data showing unemployment had risen to its highest level in 4 years, creating the illusion of a link between the arrests and domestic economic problems. In reality, it was these engineers who were creating jobs for thousands of Americans who were to build factories and maintain new production lines.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Allies in Asia saw this not just as a mistake, but as a deliberate signal. America no longer respects its partners and is willing to sacrifice long-term relationships for the sake of a political gesture. Within a week, South Korean media began using the term economic betrayal, and videos spread on social media showing deported specialists being greeted at the airport as national heroes. It was at this moment that the second factor came into play, the loss of trust at the diplomatic level. The South Korean foreign minister was forced to fly to Washington on an emergency basis to seek the release of at least some of the detainees. The negotiations lasted several days, but the result was symbolically humiliating. The engineers returned home only after Seoul's formal intervention, which underscored America's dependence on a decision that it itself had provoked. Against the backdrop of this crisis, Seoul began to actively discuss the possibility of revising military cooperation agreements. There was no talk of breaking the alliance yet, but for the first time, proposals were made in Parliament about the need to diversify the security system and rely less on American bases. For a country that had built its defense on the American shield for decades, such statements were almost revolutionary. The loss of trust among allies was not limited to Asia. Canadian think tanks released a series of reports claiming that the US was becoming an unreliable partner even for its closest neighbors. In Europe, experts began to compare the situation to the 1970s, when a crisis of confidence in the dollar first forced allies to think about their own economic independence.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
In Korea itself, this scandal led to unexpected results. Public opinion polls showed that more than 70% of the population considers America an unreliable ally. This means that any future attempt by Washington to put pressure on Seoul will be met with massive public resistance. The economic elites also drew conclusions. Several large companies announced plans to diversify their investments and increase production volumes within the country or in partner countries in Asia, but not in the US. Thus, one immigration raid, which Washington presented as an internal matter, gradually turned into an international crisis of confidence. And that was just the first warning sign. After all, if South Korea, one of America's most loyal allies in the region, felt betrayed, what could be expected from other partners? This is how America began to lose what it had been building for decades, a network of alliances based on trust and mutual benefit. And this brings us to the second point. The loss of trust among allies has become a diplomatic disaster, the scale of which Washington still does not realize. At international forums, representatives of Asian countries have begun to openly discuss the need to create a new economic bloc without the participation of the United States. In closed-door negotiations, which were later reported by sources in the Japanese media, plans were discussed to expand currency swaps and conclude long-term energy agreements in which the dollar would no longer be the main instrument. Trust is capital that is accumulated over decades but can be destroyed in an instant. For a long time, America enjoyed a reputation as a country that follows the rules, respects its allies, and takes its partners' interests into account. But now the picture has changed. Allies have begun to see the US as a country that can suddenly turn against them, guided solely by domestic political considerations. This diplomatic disaster has long-term consequences. Seoul is strengthening its ties with Tokyo and Beijing, discussing joint projects with Canada, and in Australia there is increasing talk of Pacific integration without American domination. All of this is a direct consequence of the fact that one day in the US state of Georgia, several hundred engineers found themselves in handcuffs.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
While the world's attention was focused on the diplomatic scandal between Washington and Seoul, a transformation was brewing on another front, the consequences of which America felt almost immediately. Canada, a quiet neighbor with an image as a reliable supplier of raw materials, suddenly ceased to play a secondary role and began to act as an independent strategist. Against the backdrop of Washington's mistakes, Ottawa did what even major powers rarely managed to do. In a matter of months, it broke its decade-long dependence on the American market and reoriented a significant part of its economy toward the east. At first, the changes seemed cosmetic. In early 2024, the Canadian authorities announced a series of new export programs designed to support producers of oil, gas, and critical minerals. But behind these programs lay a carefully constructed plan based on the premise that America could no longer be the sole and main buyer. As a result, the share of exports to the US fell by 10% in 1 year, which was a historic record. For comparison, similar structural shifts in other countries usually take decades. Canada managed to do it in 12 months, and this result was immediately noticed in Beijing, Seoul, and Tokyo. The main blow to the American monopoly was the launch of an expanded pipeline, which for the first time allowed Canadian oil and gas to flow directly to Pacific ports. Previously, the US effectively controlled the energy flow from the north, treating Canadian resources as its own strategic reserve. But as soon as the first tankers began to leave Vancouver for Asia, it became clear that the world's energy map was changing. For South Korea and Japan, this was not just a convenience, but a guarantee of stability. Now their energy security depended not on the whims of Washington, but on pragmatic Ottawa.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The American market felt the consequences almost immediately. Domestic oil prices began to fluctuate, and independent analysts recorded an increase in the cost of raw materials of almost 15% in a few weeks. But the psychological effect was much more serious. For decades, the US had believed that its northern neighbor would play the role of a junior partner, always ready to supply resources at a favorable price. When this illusion collapsed, investors began to wonder what else could change. Along with oil exports, Canada has placed its bets on critical minerals, without which the production of batteries, chips, and military electronics would be impossible. In May 2025, a law was passed declaring these resources to be strategic assets and restricting their export to countries unwilling to invest in green technologies. In other words, if corporations wanted to continue to have access to lithium cobalt deposits, they had to invest in environmentally friendly projects in Canada. This was a blow not only to American companies but also to their entire supply chain. America found itself in a situation where its usual supply channels were closing one after another. The blow was compounded by the fact that, against the backdrop of the scandal with South Korea, many corporations began to openly question the reliability of the US as a platform for long-term investment. Whereas previously the main goal was to build a factory in Texas or California, now options in Ontario or Quebec were increasingly being considered. Several major electronics manufacturers publicly announced plans to move part of their operations to Canada, citing stable politics and predictable conditions. But the problem was not just lost investment. The US began to lose what is the real foundation of technological leadership: human capital. The situation with South Korean engineers had already undermined the country's image as a magnet for talent. Now, Canada has managed to turn this mistake to its advantage. As part of the new program, it was announced that highly skilled professionals would receive expedited visas and tax breaks if they agreed to work for Canadian companies involved in energy and digital technologies. In just a few months, thousands of engineers from Asia and Europe submitted applications, some of whom had previously planned careers in the US. This was a painful blow to Washington. The American AI industry, based on companies such as NVIDIA and AMD, was critically dependent on foreign production and foreign specialists. When energy channels began to close and engineers began to leave at the same time, the country found itself in a situation that experts compared to a technological siege. It turned out that slogans about protecting jobs resulted in the actual loss of those very jobs. Tens of thousands of Americans lost their jobs at factories that were never built or closed due to contract terminations. The financial markets reacted predictably. Within weeks of the announcement of the Canadian reforms, shares in American energy companies fell by 12%, and the technology sector faced a massive outflow of capital. Investors began to look for more stable platforms, and funds poured into Asian and Canadian assets. International banks recorded a sharp increase in Canadian dollar transactions, which was an alarming sign for the status of the US currency. All this was happening at a time when Washington continued to demonstrate its inability to cope with its own internal crises. Industrial job losses reached a record 58,000 in a single month, the worst figure in 2 decades. But instead of acknowledging its dependence on foreign specialists and raw materials, America continued to talk about protecting national interests. As a result, the country simultaneously lost access to resources, talent, and markets. The most painful blow was symbolic. America has always positioned itself as a country that sets the rules and shapes the region, but now its closest neighbor has shown the world that it is possible to play by one's own rules. Canada has managed not only to diversify its trade, but also to use the environmental agenda as a tool of pressure. American corporations found themselves in a position where they had to either agree to new terms or risk losing access to strategic resources. Thus, 2 parallel processes, the loss of energy monopoly and the mass outflow of human capital, intertwined into a single crisis. America, seeking to protect itself with tariffs and harsh measures against foreign specialists, found itself isolated, a situation it had created with its own hands. While Canada strengthened its position in Asia and South Korea and Japan gained new channels of access to resources, the US sank deeper into stagnation. economists began to speak openly about the end of American dominance in North America. The irony was that the end came not from rivals such as China, but from allies who were no longer willing to accept the role of junior partners. The loss of confidence that began with the humiliation of engineers in Georgia turned into an avalanche that destroyed the energy and technological foundation of American leadership.